Today, we're going to be discussing the recent lawsuit filed by IIUSA against USCIS and the newly proposed rule to extend the EB5 investor minimum investment or sustainment period from 2 years to 5 years.
Now, there's two different pieces to this lawsuit, and I'll let Sam jump in a second and explain those two different pieces. But at the core, the first piece is about the change of that 2-year period from 2 years of conditional residency to just 2 years of the money being invested. That's the first piece, and really focus on how that rule was made. And then the second piece is offering a possible solution to the government of changing the sustainment period to 5 years.
The first thing that has to happen is, okay, will IIUSA be able to overturn USCIS's interpretation of how the sustainment period would work, right? And this takes months to accomplish, but let's say in the next 6 to 12 months, they actually do accomplish that. What happens then? With just that step being taken, investors are now kind of going back to the original definition, which is that you have to keep your money sustained through your 2-year temporary conditional permanent residency period, right? And that could mean that if you're in a project, let's say, when an urban one, maybe there's a lot of filings, you kind of come in at the end of that line, you're now retrogressed for a couple of years. That pushes your repayment out an additional 2 years. And if you went into a shorter term project or a project repays early, you're now at real risk of redeployment because of the way that the prior rules work now being basically re-implemented. Okay, so that's kind of the first effect and the immediate effect that we would expect, and maybe later this year, if IIUSA were to win this lawsuit, is we're going to go revert back to the old rules. The second thing that IIUSA has kind of alluded to and is going to be working towards is proposing a new rule, and this would basically fix the sustainment period at 5 years, right? And we could talk a little bit about what the justification for the 5 years is, but ultimately, this again would take several months to be enacted.
Now, where I think the biggest harm comes, and this is where it's an unintended consequence of this lawsuit, is for those investors that invested post RIA, especially the ones that invested over, let's say, the last 6 to 9 months in an urban TEA from China and India. We recently did a webinar where we looked at the data that AIIA was able to get out of the government, and our estimates are we could easily already beat a 5-year backlog for Indian and Chinese urban TEA investors, likely longer. Tons of other factors come into play, but those would be the investors that if the first part of the lawsuit is affirmed and the second is not, and it goes back to the old policy of you need to hold your money invested until you have your conditional green card for 2 years, those investors are going to go from, hey, I thought I chose an urban deal that would pay me back in 3 or 4 years. Now I'm actually going to be stuck for 8, 9, 10 years, potentially, in a redeployment loop, which is what everybody is trying to avoid, and what IIUSA is also trying to avoid with the new proposed 5-year sustainment period, is to avoid that redeployment loop. So I'd say that, at least from my perspective, those are the individuals who are absolutely going to be the most harmed by this.
Again, just who does this really impact? It's really going to negatively impact Chinese and Indian-born investors who invested in urban TEA projects, particularly in November, December of last year, 2023, and January, February, March of 2024. This 2-year policy wasn't public until October, and so a lot of these less credible, less institutional projects that have been promoting a short 2 to 3 year get your money back situation, they really only popped up in the last few months. And that same last few months is also the period where the number of investors, was the highest for the urban TEA category. And so, you've got a lot more of a backlog problem, and the type of project also coming into the market where you're going to have to redeploy. So it's a few months and a specific type of project where there's going to be problems.
First, you've got to go back to the point that still shocks me, that how many investors from China and India have filed in urban TEAs. To me, the risk of this policy, the October 23rd, being reversed and going back to the pre-RIA established policy puts you in a potential endless redeployment loop cycle where if I'm Chinese or Indian, even if I'm in the US and can adjust status, this now completely throws out my desire to do an urban TEA deal, even one with a short period, unless I'm willing to gamble. Maybe I'll get my money back in 3 years. Maybe it'll be 10 years. If you're willing to take that risk, sure. But to me, if I'm an Indian or Chinese investor, I would 100% go the rural path because this just took away the main kind of advantage of what we were seeing in some of those urban deals. So stepping aside, though, if I'm not a Chinese or Indian investor and I still have the wide variety of options, then I think you just have to make a concerted bet.